Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a question that sounds like the setup to a joke. It sounds like something you'd scribble on a napkin at 2 in the morning after your third cup of tea, still buzzing from a long evening of reading lore wikis and falling deeper down whatever rabbit hole the fandom had opened up for you that week. The question is this: what actually happens when an orc tries to join the Imperium of man? And look, on the surface, it seems like the answer should be 3 words long. It should be, they get killed. End of video. See you next time. But here's the thing. The more you sit with that question, the more it opens up into something genuinely strange and rich and interesting. Because in order to answer it properly, you have to think about what the orcs actually are, not just as an army on the tabletop, and not just as the green-skinned tide that crashes against Imperial defenses in codex after codex, but as a species woven from millions of years of engineered purpose, from biology that defies easy classification by every standard that the Adeptus Mechanicus attempts to apply to it, from a psychology that is simultaneously simpler and stranger than almost anything else in the galaxy. You have to think about what the Imperium actually is, not just as humanity's fortress against the dark, but as a civilization so thoroughly shaped by fear and faith and a very specific kind of ancient trauma that its very laws are built from hatred. Its very culture is constructed around the concept of the extermination of the other as a moral obligation rather than a last resort. You have to think about biology, about theology, about politics, and about the way that two things can be fundamentally incompatible, not because either of them is entirely wrong, but because they were each made to be exactly what they are, and what they are cannot share the same space without one or both of them ceasing to be what they are. You have to think, in other words, about everything that makes the 41st millennium the kind of place it is. A place where the most interesting questions are the ones with the saddest answers. A place where the gap between what could theoretically exist and what actually exists is vast and dark and full of consequences. The question of the orc and the Imperium is, at its heart, a question about the nature of incompatibility. Not the simple incompatibility of enemies who have chosen different sides in a conflict, but the deeper incompatibility of two things that were each made for purposes that preclude the existence of the other. The orcs were made to fight. The Imperium was made to survive. And in the 41st millennium, survival very specifically requires the killing of orcs. So no, this is not a 3-word answer. This is a story. And like all the best stories in this setting, it ends badly. But getting there is worth every quiet moment of the telling. Because in the gap between the question and the answer, in the space where the thought experiment lives, there is everything you need to understand about both of these enormous, strange, violent, tragically well-realized species. Settle in. Take a slow breath. Let the galaxy open up around you. That vast, dark cathedral of a universe with its cold stars and its ancient grudges and its species, all trapped by what they were made to be. We are going to explore this completely. Part 1. The shape of the question. Before we can talk about what the Imperium does when an orc shows up asking to join, we need to be very clear about what we mean by the word join, because it matters enormously, and the different interpretations of that word lead to very different explorations, each of which reveals different things about the fundamental incompatibility at the heart of this question. Are we talking about an orc showing up on a battlefield and switching sides mid-fight? That happens, technically speaking, with certain elements of the blood axes, and we'll get to that in considerable detail later. Are we talking about an orc presenting itself to a governor's court and requesting citizenship, asking to be registered in the Administratum's vast record systems as a resident of an imperial world? Are we talking about an orc serving as a mercenary in exchange for payment, a formal commercial transaction conducted under the authority of a warrant of trade or some similar legal instrument? Are we talking about an orc swearing fealty to the Emperor's name and asking to be inducted into the Imperial Guard? given a laser gun and a flak jacket and a regimental number and a place in formation to stand alongside men and women who have spent their entire lives being told that the orc is the enemy. Each of those scenarios produces a different answer. Each of those answers teaches us something different about both species. And each of those answers reveals a different facet of the incompatibility. What they all share, though, is a collision between two of the most fundamentally irreconcilable forces in the galaxy, an understanding that collision requires understanding both forces in their full depth before bringing them together. What they all share is a collision between two things that were each made to be what they are, and what they are is categorically incompatible with coexistence. Not simply because one of them is violent and the other is not. That would be the easy version of this story. The Imperium is extraordinarily violent. It has prosecuted wars across 10,000 years and 1,000,000 worlds, with a consistency and a ferocity that no other faction in the galaxy, including the orcs themselves, can quite match in terms of sustained institutional commitment to armed conflict. The Astra Militarum raises billions of soldiers every generation. The Adeptus Astartes are engineered killers. The Adeptus Mechanicus builds the instruments of war with religious devotion. The Inquisition burns entire populations for the crime of insufficient loyalty. The Sisters of Battle exists specifically as an organization whose primary function is violence conducted in the name of faith. The Imperium is not peaceful. It is merely organized in its violence, directed in its violence, systematic in a way that the Greenskins are not. The incompatibility runs deeper than violence. The Imperium is not merely unfriendly to aliens. It is not simply prejudiced or cautious or protective of its borders in the way that any large state might be. It maintaining reasonable wariness toward potential threats from outside. The Imperium's relationship to the alien, to every alien without meaningful exception, is theological. It is doctrinal. It has been written into the flesh of imperial culture so deeply that questioning it carries the same penalty as questioning the divinity of the emperor himself, which is to say, the questioning itself is the crime, before you've even arrived at any conclusion. Xenophilia, which is the imperial term for consorting with aliens in any context, not explicitly sanctioned by the highest levels of imperial authority, is not a social failing. It is not poor judgment or misplaced sympathy or cultural insensitivity of the kind that might be corrected with education or reprimand. It is a capital crime. It is heresy of a specific and particularly serious kind. And heresy has only one destination in the 41st millennium. Now hold that thought, because we also need to understand the orc side of this equation with equal seriousness. And the orc side is, in many ways, even more complicated, even more layered than a first glance might reveal. Because the core of the problem is not simply that orcs and humans dislike each other, though they do, with a passion and a consistency that has shaped the military history of the galaxy for as long as both have existed in their current forms. The core of the problem is that orcs are not built to want what joining would require. They are not engineered for diplomacy. They are not psychologically structured to value peace in the way that even the most warlike human civilizations must at some level acknowledge peace as a concept worth having an opinion about. The desire to join something, to become part of a larger cooperative structure for mutual benefit, to subordinate one's individual violent impulses to the requirements of a shared institution, to accept authority from something outside one's immediate peer hierarchy, to contribute to goals that transcend the next fight. These things are simply not what orcs are for. They were made for something very specific, and everything about their existence points them toward that singular purpose with the relentless directionality of a compass needle. Understanding why the answer to our question is both obvious and devastating requires understanding both of these things in their full depth. Not their surface features, not the broad strokes of orcs are green and violent, and the Imperium hates aliens. The full depth, the biology, the history, the theology, the institutional mechanics, and the specific ways in which each of these dimensions reinforces all the others to create a wall that is not merely high, but is made of something that actively resists every tool that might be used to climb it. So let's start at the actual beginning. Let's start with what an orc is, at the level where things get truly remarkable. Part 2. Who are the orcs? The biology and the breed. The first thing you need to understand about orcs is that they did not happen by accident. Most of the species in the 41st millennium evolved over unimaginable spans of time, shaped by environment and competition and predation, and the slow, blind pressure of a universe that does not care whether you survive or not. The Necrons were once flesh and blood beings who traded mortality for metal and became something cold and relentless and eternal. The Tyranids came from somewhere beyond the galaxy's edge, driven by a hunger so vast it has consumed entire star systems, moving through the void with the inevitability of a tide. The Aeldari rose over millions of years to become the dominant species of the galaxy, burned themselves in the fire of their own excess, and still burn in the embers of what they once were. The orcs were made. They were designed. They were engineered by something ancient and extraordinarily capable, as something the Imperium scholars tentatively call the Old Ones, the same beings that the Necron Lexicanum suggests created the Eldari and other psychically capable species to fight the war in heaven against the Necrontyr and their Khitan patrons. The orcs, in this reading, were the Old Ones' answer to a specific military problem. How do you create a soldier race that is self-sufficient, self-reproducing, biologically driven toward combat, and psychically capable of improving its own performance through collective belief? How do you make a weapon that never runs out of ammunition? The exact truth of these origins remains buried under tens of millions of years of history, and Imperial scholars hold various competing theories with various degrees of confidence. What is not buried, what the Magos biologists of the Adeptus Mechanicus have confirmed through painstaking analysis of captured specimens, is that orc biology shows no evidence of any evolutionary process whatsoever. There are no transitional forms pointing to a simpler ancestor. There are no vestigial structures echoing a previous stage of development. There is no fossil record that suggests the orc emerged gradually from something less. The orc genome arrived, fully formed and impossibly complex, with every system already optimized from the ground up for a single purpose: war. Consider what this actually means, held up against the light of biological science. Every component of an orc's physical existence has been tuned by ancient hands to make it the most effective possible fighting creature in the galaxy. Not the fastest, not the smartest, individually. Not the most elegant or the most durable in any single dimension, but the most comprehensively effective at the entire business of armed conflict, from the moment of engagement through to survival afterward, with the remarkable added feature that dying is itself part of the reproductive strategy. The bones are thick and dense, and filled not with the marrow you'd find in a human skeleton, but with a spongy fungal matter that makes them resistant to fracture under high-velocity impacts. A human femur will break when a vehicle runs over it. An orc femur, the Magos biologists have noted with the particular kind of admiration that academics reserve for things they find professionally impressive and personally terrifying, will not. The structural integrity of orc bone tissue is orders of magnitude beyond anything that biological engineering of the mammalian template could naturally produce. And it has been speculated that if the Old Ones' intentions were to create something that could survive on the most hostile battlefields imaginable, they succeeded beyond all reasonable expectation. The muscles are packed with fiber densities that dwarf anything a human body can produce, including, for the record, a Space Marine's enhanced frame, which is itself a remarkable piece of biological engineering representing millennia of Astartes gene tech development. In terms of raw burst strength, the muscle structure of even an average orc boy outperforms the equivalent in a first-founding Space Marine. What the Astartes have that the orc does not is precision, coordination, martial training, and the strategic intelligence to know when and where to apply that strength. The orc is a hammer. The Space Marine is a precise surgical instrument. In the right circumstances, with the right application, the instrument is more effective. But in the wrong circumstances, in a confined space with bad footing and no room to maneuver, the hammer wins. The skull is so thick that an orc can survive head injuries that would reduce a human being to a corpse without any deliberation. There are documented cases, reviewed and confirmed by Imperial medici personnel who examined captured orcs, of greenskins surviving damage to significant portions of their brain and continuing to fight, the rest of the organism compensating through the remarkable redundancy of their internal systems. But the brain itself is structured differently from a human brain, with the regions governing aggression, territorial instinct, and combat reflex dramatically overdeveloped relative to areas governing long-term planning, social nuance, and empathetic response. This is not an accident. This is a design choice. The internal organs are the most alien feature of orc anatomy for those trained in human medicine. Where a human body relies on a complex network of specialized organs, each with a specific function, and each constituting a vulnerability if damaged, the orc body replaces most of this complexity with what the Magos biologists have taken to calling a fungal soup. The body cavity is filled with fungal organisms that collectively perform the functions of liver, kidney, spleen, pancreas, and various other components of a mammalian internal architecture. These organisms are individually hardy and collectively redundant. Damage any individual element, and the others compensate. Remove what would be a fatal volume of one organ in a human being, and the orc's fungal physiology simply redistributes the workload among the surviving elements. They are not indestructible. They can be killed. The Imperium does kill them in enormous numbers, with considerable regularity. But the threshold at which an orc becomes lethally wounded is dramatically higher than for any other humanoid species. Their skin is green, and this is not simply pigmentation in the way that human skin comes in various shades based on melanin concentration. The green comes from chlorophyll, high concentrations of it in their blood and tissue, as which gives orcs a primitive but functional capacity for photosynthesis. They can, on a sunlit world, supplement their caloric intake directly from the light above them. This is not enough to sustain them on its own. Orcs eat prodigiously, consuming anything that can be swallowed, and quite a lot that arguably cannot. But it means they can survive supply disruptions that would collapse a human army in days. Their green blood, examined under appropriate analysis, contains countless distinct fungal organisms and trace elements of carbon and copper, producing a biochemistry that is simultaneously familiar in its basic architecture and profoundly alien in its specific implementation. They do not age in any conventional sense. An orc that is not killed by violence simply keeps growing. The more an orc fights, the more chemical signals its body releases. Those signals stimulate growth and development in cascading biological feedback loops. The bigger the orc becomes, the more dominant its presence in the collective hierarchy, the more followers it attracts, the more fights it has, the bigger it grows. There is theoretically no upper limit to how large an orc can become, given sufficient time and sufficient combat experience. The very largest orc warlords in history have been described in terms that approach the scale of machinery rather than biology. One of them, the one known only as the Beast, was estimated to be roughly 10 meters tall when encountered by Imperial forces in the 32nd Millennium. It's encased in armor that appeared to have grown organically from the creature's own body, rather than being manufactured and fitted in the normal way. He was described, initially, as a statue. He was not a statue. But the most remarkable thing about orcs, the feature that makes them truly singular among the species of the galaxy, and that has the most profound implications for our central question, is how they reproduce. Orcs do not reproduce sexually. They do not have children in any conventional sense. They do not have a family unit, a gender binary, in any meaningful sense, a mating season, or any of the usual biological mechanisms through which complex organisms pass genetic information to the next generation. Instead, every orc releases spores throughout its entire life. These spores are microscopic. They drift on air currents and settle into soil and find their way into water and propagate through the environment with the casual unstoppability of something that has been specifically designed to go everywhere and establish itself in everything. In the soil, these spores begin the process of growing into new orcs through a complex underground fungal network that develops over time with a patient, botanical rhythm entirely unlike anything in the orc's conscious behavior. This network first produces fungal growths that begin converting the local soil chemistry into something more hospitable to the orcoid ecosystem. Then it produces squigs, those small snapping creatures that orcs use for food and entertainment and occasional medical purposes. Creatures that look like nothing so much as a very enthusiastic mouthful of teeth on rudimentary legs. Then it produces snotlings, who tend the fungus and perform the earliest agricultural work of the greenskin ecosystem. Then Gretchen, who begin building rudimentary structures and performing the first recognizably complex social behaviors of the growing settlement. And finally, the orcs themselves, fully formed and immediately aggressive, carrying in their genetic code all the biological knowledge their species possesses, ready to fight from the first moment of independent consciousness. At the moment of death, an orc releases an especially large concentration of spores. Every dead orc is, in a very real sense, planting the seeds of future orcs in the ground around it. Every orc battlefield is an agricultural event, even if the only crop it produces is more violence. The Margos biologists of the Ordo Xenos have estimated, in studies that make for grim reading in the relevant archived reports, that the only way to permanently cleanse an orc infestation from a planet is exterminatus, the complete destruction of all life on that world's surface, to a depth and temperature sufficient to sterilize every dormant spore in the soil. Otherwise, decades after the last orc appears to have been killed, feral tribes will emerge from wilderness areas, grown from the spores left behind by their predecessors, ready to resume the eternal war their forebears were in the middle of when they died. The galaxy is saturated with orc spores. They exist in the soil of almost every world that has ever seen a greenskin presence. They drift through space on debris and wreckage and the exhaust trails of orc spacecraft. They are dormant on worlds that have been cleansed of orcs multiple times, over multiple centuries. The orcs are more numerous as a species than humanity. They are more numerous than any other species in the Milky Way galaxy. The reason they have not conquered everything, the reason there is still an Imperium and an Aeldari remnant and a Tau Empire and everything else, is not that they lack the numbers or the biological tools. It is that they are too busy fighting each other. The moment any sustained fighting between orc factions stops, and all of that energy gets directed outward, things get very difficult for whoever is in the way. This is where the second extraordinary feature of orc biology enters the picture. And this one has implications that reach into theology and physics and the nature of the warp itself, the Gestalt psychic field. Individually, an orc possesses no significant psychic power in the way that a human psyker does. They cannot touch the warp consciously, cannot draw on it deliberately, cannot throw lightning from their hands or see the future or read minds. But orcs are not designed to be powerful alone. They are designed to be powerful together. Every orc generates a low-level psychic emission, a frequency in the immaterium that is tuned to the specific resonance of greenskin consciousness. And when enough of these emissions combine in the same place, something remarkable happens. The combined field grows into something that literally, physically, measurably shapes reality in the immediate vicinity. This is not metaphor. This is not cultural belief that is simply wrong but feels real. This is documented imperial fact confirmed by multiple Magos biologists in studies that were immediately classified and then reclassified several more times as the implications sank in. Orc rockets painted yellow create larger explosions because the orcs believe they do. and the strength of their collective belief is sufficient to alter actual physical outcomes through the medium of the warp. Red vehicles move faster because a critical mass of orcs are convinced that they do, and the collective confidence of thousands of greenskins is, through the Gestalt field, as physically real as a mechanical improvement. Purple is a color of invisibility in orc perception, and there are accounts of camouflaged orc units going genuinely unnoticed far longer than their physical concealment should have allowed. The scoped eyes of Imperial sharpshooters sliding past figures that were, objectively, standing in plain view. The collective orc mind bends the laws of physics around itself, not dramatically, not in ways that manifest as visible supernatural phenomena, but consistently and measurably in ways that give orc technology capabilities far beyond what its crude construction should permit. Orc technology is, by every objective measure, garbage. It is assembled from scrap and salvage and enthusiasm and the intuitive engineering sense that mech boys carry in their genetics. It should not function at the level it does. Was combustion engines built from salvaged vehicle parts and sheet metal and imagination should not power vehicles that cross continents. Guns assembled from whatever metal happened to be lying nearby should not fire reliably or with sufficient force to penetrate ceramite armor. And yet they do, because a sufficient concentration of orcs believe that they do. They were made this way. Ancient hands, long gone and silent, built this creature and embedded in its very cells the knowledge of how to fight, how to build the instruments of war, and how to maintain them. Mech boys, the orc engineers, do not learn their trade in schools or through lengthy apprenticeships or through any kind of formal educational process. They feel it the way a human child instinctively holds its breath underwater, the way a horse can walk within an hour of being born. Yet the knowledge is encoded in their genetics, a biological technology so advanced that the Adeptus Mechanicus, for all their millennia of study and their vast repositories of archaeological science, cannot fully replicate it. The mech boy who has never seen a plasma generator can still tell you what is wrong with the one in front of him, because on some deep biological level that predates any individual orc's experience, he already knows. This was a species built to fight forever, built to grow through fighting, built to reproduce through dying, built to reshape reality around itself in the service of war. The ancient engineers who created the orcs were building the ultimate soldier race, a biological weapon system of unprecedented sophistication. They succeeded completely. The fact that those ancient engineers are long gone, that their civilization vanished into the deep past, and the orcs now fight whoever is in front of them, including the heirs of those who once directed them, is simply one of the setting's many ironies. It's quite a profound one when you sit with it. Part 3. The Soul of the Green. Society, Hierarchy, and what orcs actually believe. To understand what would happen if an orc tried to approach the Imperium with any kind of peaceful intent, you need to understand what an orc wants out of existence, what drives it, what it values, what it would need to give up in order to participate in any institution that the Imperium would recognize as legitimate. And the answer to all of these questions is both simpler and more nuanced than it might initially appear. Orc society runs on a single operating principle: whoever is biggest is in charge. This is not merely a social convention that developed over generations of cultural tradition. It is biological law, written into the physiology of every orc that has ever lived. As an orc fights and wins, its body releases chemical signals that stimulate growth. As it grows larger, the chemical signals it emits grow stronger and more pervasive. Those signals are detected, subconsciously but absolutely, by every other orc in range, and they produce an instinctive deference that is not a choice but a compulsion. A very large orc does not need to argue for its authority or cultivate political allies, or perform elaborate rituals of dominance, or spend years building a reputation among its peers. It simply is dominant, in a way that every other orc in the vicinity immediately and viscerally understands, but the way you understand that a charging animal is bigger than you without having to measure it. the hierarchy is visible in the bodies of its participants. An orc warband looks like a three-dimensional diagram of its own power structure, with the biggest and most battle-scarred creature at the top, and the smallest creatures, the Gretchen and Snotlings, at the very bottom, so physically different from the orcs above them that they might almost be a different species. The progression from Snotling to Gretchen to Orc Boy to Nob to Warboss to Warlord is not just a social ladder, it is a biological one. Each step up represents not just more authority, but a more developed organism, one that has been made by combat into something physically larger and more capable and more chemically dominant than what it was before. But the Nobs are the officer class, orcs who have grown large enough through successful fighting to command the regular boys, who wear the best armor available to them and carry the best weapons they can acquire or take, and who enforce their authority with a combination of physical dominance and the particular brand of aggressive mentorship that passes for leadership development in greenskin culture. Above them, the war bosses, the biggest and most dangerous individuals in any given tribe, hold authority by virtue of being unkillable, or at least visibly closer to unkillable than anyone else in the room. A war boss that stops winning stops being a war boss, usually because someone has hit it hard enough to make the hierarchy renegotiation happen spontaneously. And above even the war bosses, rarely but memorably, emerge the warlords, individuals whose victories have accumulated over decades or centuries until they are something genuinely different from the orcs around them. Something that commands not just deference, but the particular reverence that very large and very powerful things inspire in beings who are also large and powerful, but demonstrably less so. The greatest warlords in orc history have commanded forces so vast they can be measured in the same scale as natural disasters. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka, the warlord who twice brought war to the hive world of Armageddon and has since taken his war across the galaxy, commands billions of greenskins through a combination of physical dominance, genuine tactical capability, and the specific kind of divine mandate authority that comes from claiming and having other orcs believe. Yet that the gods themselves speak through you. This hierarchy is genuinely meritocratic, in the most brutally literal sense of that word. You earn your position through combat, and you keep it by remaining better at combat than anyone else. The moment you stop being the most dangerous orc in the room, the next most dangerous orc in the room becomes the most dangerous orc in the room. And the transition is usually marked by a very short and very violent conversation. There are no inherited titles. There is no nepotism in any meaningful sense. There is no position that can be secured through money or social connection rather than physical capability, though wealth, as measured in orc teeth currency, does correlate with the ability to purchase better weapons and armor, which correlates with winning more fights, which correlates with growing bigger, which feeds directly back into the hierarchy. Within this structure, specialist roles emerge not through training or education, but through genetics. The odd boys are orcs, who are born predisposed towards specific non-combat functions that the larger orc society requires in order to function as a society at all, rather than just as a mob. The mech boys are the engineers, who wake up knowing how machines work at an intuitive level and spend their lives building bigger and louder and more spectacularly explosive versions of the things that already exist. The knowledge in their genetics is not encyclopedic in the way that a trained engineer's knowledge is encyclopedic. It is more like a comprehensive intuition, a sense of how power should flow and where structures will fail and what configuration of components will produce the desired output, applied with enormous enthusiasm and limited concern for conventional safety standards. The pain boys are the surgeons, a term used loosely for beings whose idea of medical care involves a great deal of enthusiasm and a somewhat flexible attitude toward which limb gets reattached to which socket. The orc physiology is robust enough to survive the pain boys' interventions, mostly, and the bionics they install function because of the same gestalt field mechanism that makes all orc technology work. which is to say they function because the orc wearing them believes they will, and the collective field reinforces that belief. An orc with a replacement leg of obviously salvaged scrap metal and questionable structural integrity will walk on it, fight on it, and run on it, because the alternative is sitting still, and sitting still is not really in the orc vocabulary. The weird boys are the psychers, orcs whose connection to the collective gestalt field is strong enough that they can consciously channel it, gathering the psychic energy of the fighting around them and releasing it in blasts of raw, green-tinged warp energy that they aim at enemies with varying degrees of accuracy and considerably varying degrees of personal safety. The specific risk of being a weird boy is that absorbing too much collective battlefield energy has a tendency to cause a weird boy's head to explode, or which is considered dramatic even by the standards of a species that treats dramatic almost as a life goal. Weird boys are accordingly accompanied by minders, specifically designated orcs, whose job is to prevent the weird boy from running away from a battle where the psychic energy is building to dangerous levels, because a weird boy left to its own devices would sensibly absent itself from the conflict before the threshold was reached. And a war boss who has a weird boy is not paying for a sensible absent weird boy, he is paying for a channeled blast of warp energy delivered in the direction of his enemies. The 6 great clans of the orcs add another layer of cultural identity that sits beneath and alongside the broader greenskin social structure. The Goths are the most direct, the most aggressive, but the most invested in the philosophical position that hitting things very hard is always the correct solution to any problem, including problems that do not obviously require hitting. They produce an unusual proportion of knobs and war bosses, which makes sense when you consider that their cultural values align precisely with the biological mechanism by which knobs and war bosses are produced. The bad moons are the wealthy ones, growing their teeth faster than other orcs, and leveraging this biological accident into commercial dominance, spending extravagantly on the finest weapons and armor, and generally annoying everyone else by being flashy about it. The currency of orc society is, literally, orc teeth, and the teeth regenerate periodically in the manner of shark teeth, which means the bad moon's faster tooth growth rate translates directly into financial advantage. They are not popular with the other clans, but they are well equipped, which in orc society is the more functionally important of those two things. The evil sons have organized their entire cultural identity around vehicles and velocity, and the almost spiritual experience of going very fast toward enemies. They would describe this as a religious practice if they use such language, which they don't. But the reverence with which an evil son's orc regards a particularly fast vehicle is not meaningfully different from the reverence with which an ecclesiarchy priest regards a particularly sacred relic. The vehicle is holy. The speed is the prayer. The crash at the end, preferably into as many enemies as possible, is the liturgy. While the death skulls are the looters, the scavengers, the orcs, who understand instinctively that the best equipment is equipment you found for free on a corpse and painted blue for luck. They are the most visually distinctive clan, that blue paint being both a cultural marker and a functional lucky charm, that the gestalt field makes genuinely luckier, and they have an unfortunate tendency to regard equipment belonging to other orcs with the same proprietary interest they apply to equipment belonging to dead enemies. This makes them deeply unpopular houseguests. The snakebites are the traditionalists who regard all this machinery and technology with deep suspicion and prefer to ride into battle on huge boars and cover themselves in tattoos and make do with muscle and enthusiasm. They are, by the standards of the rest of greenskin society, the conservatives, which is a sentence that does not mean what you think it means when you're talking about a species whose primary cultural expression is organized violence against everything within reach. And then there are the blood axes, the 6th great clan, and the one that makes this entire conversation possible in ways that we'll explore at length. For now, know only that they exist, and that their existence represents the closest thing to a bridge between these two species that the galaxy has ever produced. Now, what do orcs believe? This is where things get theologically rich, because orcs are not atheists. They are not spiritually empty. They have gods. 2 of them, in fact. And those gods are as real as any divine entity in the 41st millennium. Which, in a universe where divine entities demonstrably exist in the warp and demonstrably influence the physical world, means they are genuinely real. These entities are called Gork and Mork. Gork is brutal but cunning. Mork is cunning but brutal. The difference between these 2 descriptions is the subject of wars, genuine wars, ongoing and long-running conflicts between orc tribes who have taken contrary positions on which is which. Nobody knows who is right. The orcs themselves cannot agree, and they will fight you about this, and they will fight each other about this, and the fights are exactly as vigorous and unresolved as you might expect from a species for whom war is both religion and entertainment and social practice. The ambiguity is not a failure of orc theology, it is the core of it. My Gork and Mork are not gods who demand worship in the conventional sense. They don't particularly want prayers or constructed rituals or cathedrals of polished stone. They want fighting. Specifically, they want the best kind of fighting, not the reckless, suicidal kind that wastes perfectly good orcs for no gain, but the kind that is brutal and cunning in equal measure, the kind that produces victory through both raw force and clever application of that force. Gork hits you when you're watching. He hits you harder when you're watching, because he knows you're watching, and that makes the hit better. Mork hits you when you're not watching, because he knows you're not watching, and that makes the hit more satisfying. Between them, Gork and Mork cover all possible situations in which something could be hit, which from the orc perspective is a comprehensive theology. Every orc who fights well, who fights cunningly, who fights with purpose and aggression in a way that creates the kind of magnificent violence that fills the Imperium with green-tinged psychic resonance, is worshipping Gork and Mork, whether they think about it in those terms or not. The orc who charges headlong into a superior position and dies for nothing is not worshipping them. That orc was not brutal enough and not cunning enough, and has accordingly been removed from the gene pool, which is in its own way a theological statement. The 2 gods dwell in a place in the warp called the Great Green, and they fight each other there constantly, because that is what orc gods do. The orc creation myth, insofar as one exists, involves Gork hitting Mork very hard in the mouth, and the resulting tooth becoming the world. Or possibly it was Mork hitting Gork. The orcs are not entirely sure. The uncertainty is accepted with the equanimity of beings for whom the details of ancient history matter much less than the quality of the violence involved. What is critically important to understand about Gork and Mork is that they are not metaphors. They are not cultural constructs that exist only in orc belief. The orc's collective psyche is so vast, the gestalt field so powerful and so constant, that it has produced actual entities in the warp, beings of genuine metaphysical presence that interact with the immaterium, and through it with the physical world. They are not chaos gods. They are not aligned with or serving any of the dark powers of the ruinous powers. They are something older and stranger, and in some ways more direct, the distilled warlike soul of the most numerous species in the galaxy, given form and will and the ability to keep hitting things essentially forever. The Adeptus Mechanicus's theological assessment of Gork and Mork is best described as deep professional discomfort. The Ordo Malleus, which exists to deal with things from the warp, views them as a category they weren't entirely designed for.
Okay, real talk for a second. I genuinely think the orcs are one of the most underrated pieces of world building in all of science fiction. No, not fantasy, not games, all of science fiction. Because on the surface they're a joke, they're loud, they're green, they paint things red and believe it makes them go faster. And then you actually sit with what they are and you realize someone thought incredibly hard about what a biological weapon system left running for millions of years after the war was designed for would actually look like. And the answer is this: a species that is fighting because fighting is literally what it exists to do. And somehow that's funnier and sadder and more interesting than almost anything else in the setting. That's what I love about this lore. The longer you look, the stranger and richer it gets. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
The ecclesiarchy considers them an abomination, false gods that draw worship away from the emperor, and in doing so, commit the gravest spiritual crime possible. None of this bothers Gork and Mork in the slightest. Part 4. The Imperium's Iron Heart. Xenophobia as law, as faith, as instinct. The Imperium of Man did not start as a xenophobic institution. Yet in the early days of the Great Crusade, before the Horus heresy cracked the architecture of everything and let darkness seep into every joint, there were human civilizations that had found ways to coexist with alien species. The Interrex were one such civilization, humans who had built a functioning multi-species culture, keeping careful and diplomatic relations with alien neighbors and living in genuine mutual coexistence. The Diasporex were another, a fleet-based human culture that had integrated alien species into its community over generations. The Emperor's legions destroyed them both, not for being corrupted by chaos, not for worshipping the ruinous powers, but specifically and explicitly for the crime of having alien friends. This tells you something important about how deep the roots of imperial xenophobia go, and it also reveals something uncomfortable about why it exists, beyond simple bigotry. The galaxy of the 41st millennium is genuinely, objectively dangerous in ways that make the extermination of alien species a defensible policy rather than simply a monstrous one. The Age of Strife, the long period of galactic chaos that preceded the Great Crusade and during which the nascent Imperium was being forged in the Emperor's image, saw alien species that had previously been at peace with humanity turn on human worlds and enslave or exterminate their populations when the opportunity presented itself. The lesson the Imperium drew from this experience, the lesson that the Emperor apparently endorsed even before the heresy made everything vastly worse, was that aliens could not be trusted. That any apparent friendship was a vulnerability waiting to be exploited, and that the only safe alien was a dead one. There is a kind of terrible logic to this that is worth taking seriously, rather than dismissing as simple prejudice. The galaxy is full of things that want humanity dead. The Tyranids consume everything biological. The forces of chaos want human souls specifically. The Necrons have awakened with their ancient grudge against all life. The Drukhari raid and abduct for sport and sustenance. In this context, the policy of treating every alien species as a potential threat until proven definitively otherwise, and of recognizing that the proof required might be impossible to obtain, is not obviously wrong. The problem is that treat as a threat until proven otherwise has, over 10,000 years, and hardened into treat as a threat full stop, and the hardening has been maintained and deepened by institutional forces that benefit from the simplicity of an absolute rule. After the heresy, this instinct became doctrine, codified into law and religion in ways that made it essentially impossible to question. The Adeptus Ministorum, the church that grew in the Emperor's name after his incapacitation, transformed pragmatic military xenophobia into sacred law. The Imperial Creed, as it developed, declares that humanity is the chosen species of the galaxy, that the Emperor's divine plan requires human dominance, and that all alien life represents an affront to that plan. To coexist with a Xenos is to question the creed. To trade with one is heresy. To assist one, defend one, hide one from imperial justice, or treat one with anything approaching the respect owed to a person rather than an animal is a capital crime. The charge is called xenophilia, and those found guilty of it are branded as heretics and face punishments that range from summary execution to elaborate public processes of condemnation that serve as warnings to others. The Ordo Xenos of the Holy Inquisition was created in the mid-32nd millennium, specifically in the aftermath of the War of the Beast, that catastrophic period when an orc warlord of impossible scale and intelligence nearly succeeded in destroying the Imperium entirely and actually threatened Terra itself. The fact that the most dangerous alien threat in recorded Imperial history was carried out by orcs is that it was an orc invasion that brought the Imperium to its knees in a way that nothing had done since the heresy itself. added a particular and specific urgency to the xenophobic doctrine where greenskins were concerned. There is no alien species in the Imperium's long and bloody catalogue of enemies that carries more accumulated institutional trauma than the orcs. They have invaded more worlds. They have killed more humans over more sustained periods of time. They have demonstrated more times than any institution likes to calculate that even a completely defeated horde leaves behind seeds of future destruction that may take decades to germinate, but will always, eventually, produce a new war. The Inquisitor who destroyed an orc army and walked away, satisfied that the job was done, is an Inquisitor who, 40 years later, it has to explain to a planetary governor why feral greenskins are raiding the southern settlements of what was supposed to be a clean world. The Ordo Xenos does not merely hunt alien invaders. It studies alien species in extraordinary depth, not out of curiosity or any form of intellectual respect, but because understanding an enemy is the most efficient way to destroy it. Inquisitors of the Ordo Xenos accumulate knowledge about alien biology, psychology, culture, social structures, military doctrine, and reproductive strategies that exceeds what any other human organization possesses. This knowledge is classified at multiple levels, shared only on a need-to-know basis, and used primarily to identify weaknesses, to develop countermeasures, and to ensure that no alien threat ever again reaches the scale that the beast achieved in the 32nd millennium. The chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos is the Death Watch. A Space Marine chapter assembled from veterans drawn from dozens of other chapters, chosen specifically for their expertise in killing specific alien species. Their power armor is painted black, distinguishing them from their original chapter colors. They carry weapons loaded with specialized ammunition, bolt rounds designed to detonate inside the specific physiology of a tyrannid lictor, melter charges calibrated to penetrate the specific density of Necron resurrection armor, explosive payloads formulated to be maximally destructive in orc tissue. They operate in small, flexible kill teams that can be deployed anywhere within the Imperium within days, responding to threats that normal military forces lack the specialized capability to address. Their sole function is the removal of alien threats by whatever means necessary, and if that means signing off on an exterminatus order that burns an entire world to sterilized rock in order to deny orc spores a foothold, then the kill team that makes that call will sleep, to whatever extent Space Marines sleep, without difficulty. This is the institutional apparatus that any orc approaching the Imperium with any kind of intent would need to navigate. Not just a garrison of nervous soldiers, not just a suspicious governor and his guards who might be bribed or argued into flexibility. An entire theological and military apparatus, tens of thousands of years in the building. It maintained at enormous cost and staffed by some of the most capable and most specifically trained killers in human history, specifically engineered to detect, study, and eliminate exactly what that orc represents. The practical reality on the ground is somewhat more variable than the doctrine suggests, because the Imperium is enormous beyond the ability of any single mind to meaningfully encompass, spanning 1 million worlds, governed by institutions that are inconsistent, poorly coordinated, operating on different information to different timescales, and often as concerned with their own political survival as with the strict application of doctrine. A frontier world, far from the nearest inquisitorial presence, is not making the same institutional calculations as a world with an active watch fortress nearby. A desperate governor facing an imminent chaos incursion and running completely out of military options is not in the same psychological and political position as a comfortable imperial noble in a secure core system who can afford the luxury of absolute principle. History has shown that when the options are bad enough, pragmatic exceptions to even the most absolute rules occasionally get made. Quietly, without documentation if possible, in ways that can be denied if necessary. But they are the exception. They are the thin crack in a wall of stone, and that crack does not widen without eventual consequence. Part 5. The Blood Axe's Exception. when orcs almost played nice. The blood axes are the only reason this conversation is not entirely theoretical, and they represent the single most sustained instance of something approaching cooperation between the orc species and human institutions. And studying them carefully tells us an enormous amount about both what is possible and what the hard limits of that possibility actually are. They are one of the 6 major orc clans, and they are the first to have had significant, prolonged contact with the Imperium of man. This contact changed them in ways that no other orc clan has been changed by any external influence, and those changes are remarkable and instructive, and also, when you look at them clearly, somewhat heartbreaking in their implications. When the Blood Axes first encountered Imperial forces, rather than simply fighting them in the uncomplicated way most orcs would, they watched. They paid sustained attention to how humans organized themselves in military contexts. They observed the tactics that Imperial Guard commanders used, the way soldiers were deployed in disciplined formations with clear chains of command, the logic of retreating to consolidate strength, rather than dying for the sake of the aggressive posture, the value of camouflage and concealment in reducing casualties during the vulnerable approach phase of an assault. They absorbed all of this information in the way that orcs absorb information, not through study or deliberate intellectual engagement, but through instinct and observation and the gradual modification of behavior that comes from seeing what works and having the neural architecture to register and act on that observation. The result is an orc clan that uses camouflage. They don't always understand exactly why camouflage works. The cognitive concepts of light wavelengths and visual processing, and the neurological basis of pattern recognition that make concealment effective, are not intuitive to a species whose primary approach to problems is hitting them. But they believe camouflage works, and their belief, through the Gestalt field, makes it work in their hands in ways that their poorly matched patterns and occasionally neon bright color choices should not permit. A Blood Axe commando unit stalking through a jungle wearing camouflage that is technically all wrong for the environment will still be harder to spot than it should be, because the collective conviction that it is hidden creates a genuine, measurable concealment effect. The result is also an orc clan that retreats. This is so fundamentally against the grain of standard orc psychology that other clans regard it with something between suspicion and visceral disgust. In the orc value system, retreating is losing, is dying, is failing. That you come back later, that you regroup and return with greater numbers and better preparation, and the advantage of preserved fighting strength, these tactical realities do not make retreating less shameful. Except for the Blood Axes, they do, because they have watched human commanders do it and seen it work, and incorporated it into their operational thinking in a way that their clan's genetics and cultural exposure have made possible. They don't call it retreating, they call it coming back for a nouveau go, which is presented as a different thing entirely, and the sincerity with which they make this distinction is itself telling. They trade with humans, not all of them. Not always. Not in a way that would survive any kind of formal imperial scrutiny. But in the frontier regions, in the places where the Imperium's institutional reach fades into something more like a suggestion than a law, there are documented cases of Blood Axe elements negotiating with human settlements for weapons, vehicles, fuel, and other resources, offering in exchange mineral wealth, labor in specific contexts, or simply the promise of not attacking the settlement. Whether this constitutes trade in any meaningful sense, or simply a more structured form of threat with implied violence, is a philosophical question that frontier planetary governors do not generally have the luxury of entertaining. And they have worked as mercenaries for human forces. This is the most remarkable thing about the Blood Axes, and it is documented in imperial records that are sealed at high classification levels, because the existence of such arrangements is itself a potential violation of imperial doctrine. Kill teams of Blood Axe commandos have been hired through rogue trader intermediaries and other entities operating in the grey areas of imperial law to perform military operations that the hiring party wanted done and lacked the capacity to do in the conventional way. The Blood Axes go somewhere, They kill something, or many things. They take the payment that was agreed. Sometimes they leave. Sometimes they don't. When the leaving turns out to be less interesting than the opportunity that presents itself in the alternative direction. And other orcs regard the blood axes with the specific and intense contempt that communities reserve for members who have visibly departed from the values that define the community's identity. The charge of being a humi lover, of having been contaminated by human culture and human thinking, carries genuine social weight among orcs and affects the blood axe's ability to participate in broader greenskin coalitions. A warlord assembling a large combined force will work with blood axes if they're available and willing, because their tactical abilities are genuinely useful, but the relationship is never entirely comfortable, and the side-eyeing from the Goth contingent is constant and occasionally escalates. But here is what the blood axes actually demonstrate about the limits of what we're asking. They are not trying to join the Imperium. They have never been trying to join the Imperium. They are orcs who have adopted some human tactical tools for the purpose of being more effective orcs. The mercenary relationship, when it exists, is the extent of their interest in human institutions. They want payment. They want satisfying targets. They want the freedom to leave when the arrangement ceases to be interesting. Every human concept they have absorbed, every tactical doctrine, every commercial practice, every piece of equipment they have adopted, serves the same fundamental purpose, making them better at what orcs are for. The gap between fighting alongside humans for payment and being a member of the Imperium is not a small gap. It is the entire distance between a commercial transaction and a civilization. Part 6. The thought experiment begins. An orc at the gate. So, let's actually do this. Let's walk through the scenario step by step, as concretely and as honestly as we can, because the specific mechanisms by which this would fail are as interesting as the general principle. An orc, let's say a blood axe, because that's the version most likely to have the necessary context and the necessary inclination toward anything resembling a diplomatic approach, approaches an imperial settlement, not an army, not a warband, not even a small mob. One orc. It is armed, because asking an orc to approach anything completely unarmed is like asking a river to be dry. The thing and the request are constitutionally incompatible. But it is not actively firing those weapons. It is moving in a way that, for an orc, constitutes a gesture of non-aggression. Its hands are not raised in the human sense, but they are not gripping its weapons in the ready-to-use position either. For all the intent in the world, it looks like exactly what it is. An enormous green humanoid creature built for war, choosing, improbably, not to exercise that capacity at this specific moment. The first thing that happens is that every human on the perimeter fires at it. This is not an overreaction in any meaningful sense. This is not bigotry in the simple social sense of that word, the reflexive hostility of those who fear what they don't understand. This is an entirely rational response from the perspective of every soldier on that wall. Every piece of military training they have received, every briefing, every field manual, every institutional memory of the Astra Militarum says the same thing clearly and unambiguously. Orcs attack. That is what orcs do. That is the foundational operational fact around which every strategy for dealing with orcs is built. An orc that is not currently attacking is either an orc that is about to attack, an orc that is waiting for reinforcements before it attacks, or an orc that has been instructed to approach without attacking as the first phase of a more complex assault plan, none of which are situations that suggest the appropriate response is to stand down. The orc, being an orc, does not fall down from this. It takes the hits, which it was engineered to do, and continues approaching, which it also does because stopping would be embarrassing, and retreating would be more embarrassing still, even by blood axe standards. This sequence of events, the orc approaching, the humans firing, the orc absorbing fire and continuing, the humans firing more, The orc, still not dying, is deeply alarming to everyone involved for different reasons. The humans are alarmed because an orc that takes this much firepower and keeps coming is an orc that represents a calibration problem they were not prepared for. The orc is beginning to develop an opinion about the quality of the welcome, and that opinion is moving in a direction that makes further diplomacy unlikely. If the orc is sufficiently unusual, it manages to communicate in some form that it is not here to fight on this occasion. How it does this is deeply dependent on the circumstance. Blood-axe individuals who have spent significant time around human forces can develop a functional working knowledge of Gothic, not the eloquent literary register that a trained scribe would recognize as proper High Gothic, but the rough conversational form of the language that common soldiers use. Basic concepts, delivered with the accents and grammatical structures of a species whose language is quite different in its fundamental architecture, are communicable. Not here for fight is a communicable concept in any language if you are creative enough and the stakes are high enough. What happens next depends enormously on who is on the other side of that gate, on what their orders are, what their institutional situation is, what their personal tolerance for deviation from standard protocol is, how desperate they currently are, and how far from the nearest inquisitorial oversight they find themselves. In the vast majority of cases, what happens next is continued shooting, and then more shooting, and then the calling of reinforcements and the request for inquisitorial support, if any is available within reasonable distance. The officer in charge makes the only call that their training and doctrine and institutional experience supports. They maintain fire until the orc either goes away or stops moving. If the orc stops moving, they burn the body. If the orc goes away, they report the contact, request investigation, and spend a very uncomfortable week waiting to find out how the Inquisition responds. But there is a narrow category of circumstances, a sliver of the enormous range of situations that exist across 1 million worlds with 1 million different governors and 1 million different local crisis situations, where someone on that wall pauses, where the officer makes a call that is not in the manual, or where there is someone present who has, by some accident of curriculum or obsessive personal interest, actually studied orcish linguistics, where the planetary governor is facing a threat so severe and so immediate that information from any source, even this one, might be worth the tactical risk of obtaining it. In that narrow sliver, a conversation becomes possible, and this is where the truly interesting problems begin to reveal themselves. The conversation, such as it is, has to navigate several compounding difficulties simultaneously. The linguistic gap is real and substantial. The orc's Gothic, however functional, is not precise, and the things the orc is trying to express are concepts that do not translate neatly from green skin to human cultural frameworks. When an orc indicates it wants to fight for you, this can mean anything from wanting to serve as a mercenary in a specific engagement to wanting to challenge the local commander to personal combat to establish dominance, depending on how the body language is read and how the specific idioms land. The human's problem is even more fundamental. They have no framework for this. The training manuals say kill it. The theology says kill it. The chain of command says kill it. The memory of every orc they have ever encountered, every story they have heard, every casualty report they have ever read says that whatever this creature wants, whatever apparently cooperative intent it appears to present, its fundamental nature will reassert itself eventually, and the only question is whether that reassertion happens in a context where it can be contained. Part 7. The Beast Speaks Gothic. The Impossible Intelligence Problem. Let's make the thought experiment significantly harder. Let's say our orc is not merely a blood axe with some functional linguistic competence. Let's say our orc is genuinely, unusually, remarkably intelligent. Intelligent at the level that the law documents as possible, because this is important to establish. Orc intelligence is not a fixed quantity. It scales. It develops. And at its highest recorded expression, it has produced things that shocked even beings who thought they understood what orcs were. But the gestalt field grows stronger with more orcs, and with the intensity of the ongoing conflict those orcs are engaged in. At sufficient scale and sufficient intensity, this field does something beyond powering crude technology and making red paint functionally faster. It accelerates the biological development of the most capable individuals in the gathering, pushing them towards something that ancient lore calls the Krork, the ancestral form of the orc race, beings that were supposedly the equals of the Old One's most capable creations. What Imperial scholars have documented as prime orcs are the modern expression of this tendency. The Beast, the warlord whose campaign in the 32nd Millennium nearly destroyed the Imperium, spoke perfect, flawless Imperial Gothic, not with an accent that needed interpretation. Not with the broken grammar and approximate vocabulary of someone who has learned a language through immersion without formal instruction. With the grammatical precision and vocabulary range of a being that had genuinely internalized the language at a sophisticated level of comprehension. The Primarch Vulcan, the Salamanders. Primarch, who was present when the Beast made its first extended verbal engagement with Imperial forces, was profoundly disturbed by this. The creature addressed him as an intellectual equal, as someone who was capable of understanding and responding to complex communication. The Beast spoke not to negotiate, not to ask for peace or cooperation. It spoke to explain. It spoke to make the humans it was about to defeat understand what was happening to them and why. And it spoke because communication at that level was itself a form of dominance, a demonstration of capability that went beyond the physical, a way of making the defeat more complete by ensuring that those being defeated understood it in full. The intelligence, when it manifested at the most extreme level ever recorded, did not produce a creature that wanted cooperation. It produced a creature that wanted more sophisticated conflict. Even a blood axe of unusual intelligence, our hypothetical negotiator, does not actually want to be part of the Imperium in the way that membership of an institution requires. The intelligence does not override the nature. In a strange way, greater intelligence in an orc makes the incompatibility more clear rather than less, because an intelligent orc understands its own nature better than a standard boy does. And an orc that understands its own nature clearly understands that it does not want what joining the Imperium would actually involve. What an intelligent blood axe wants is the mercenary relationship. It wants defined terms. This fight, this duration, this payment, these targets. It wants the freedom to evaluate at any point whether the arrangement is still delivering what it wants. It wants the option to leave without negotiation when the arrangement stops being interesting. These are not unreasonable wants in the abstract. They describe a transactional relationship that various frontier institutions of the Imperium have, as we've discussed, engaged in before. But they describe something specifically and crucially different from membership. The Imperium cannot employ contractors in the way that the orc's conception of the arrangement implies. There is no mechanism in Imperial law for an alien entity to function as an independent agent fighting under Imperial colors for payment. There are rogue traders who can hire mercenaries, including alien ones, under their warrant's authority. There are inquisitors who can make ad hoc arrangements justified under emergency powers. There are desperate governors who do things that never get written down. But none of these represent joining the Imperium in any recognizable sense. They represent the use of a tool. The Imperium does not consider the tool a member of the institution. And the intelligent orc, if it is genuinely intelligent, would understand this. Would recognize that what is being offered is the mercenary arrangement and not membership. Would perhaps be fine with this, because membership is not actually what it wants. What it wants is the mercenary arrangement. And at that point, the conversation has come full circle. We are back to the blood axes and their occasional contractual arrangements with frontier officials, which is a thing that exists, but which falls very far short of the question we started asking. The more interesting case, the one that genuinely tests the limits, is this. What if an orc of unusual intelligence actually wanted, genuinely, as a matter of genuine desire and not tactical calculation, to be part of something larger? to serve something beyond the next fight, to exist in a context that gave its violence meaning beyond the violence itself. This would be, it has to be said, an extraordinarily unusual orc. It would represent a deviation from the species' engineered psychology so significant that it would raise immediate questions about whether it was actually a biological response to some specific circumstance, some unique combination of isolation and experience and Gestalt field exposure that had produced something that its creators never intended. But the law allows for it in principle. The diversity of individual expression within species is real, and the question is worth asking. If such an orc existed, what would it find when it approached the Imperium? It would find the wall, all the same walls, the xenophobia, the theology, the spore problem, the institutional inability to process the paperwork for an alien joining anything, and the Deathwatch kill team that would eventually be sent to resolve the situation. The intelligent, unusual, genuinely wanting to belong orc would encounter exactly the same set of institutional responses as the standard Bloodaxe mercenary, because the institution cannot distinguish between them. The institutions do not have a mechanism for distinguishing between them. The instrument the Ordo Xenos has developed to respond to orcs is a blunt one, necessarily, because the alternative is a precision instrument that requires you to correctly identify which orcs are safe enough to tolerate and then maintain that distinction under conditions of ongoing stress and incomplete information. And the cost of getting that wrong is an orc invasion. As Part 8, the biological catastrophe, why even a good orc is a planetary threat. We have spent considerable time exploring the cultural and philosophical incompatibilities between these two species. But there is a more immediate problem, a more concrete problem, a problem that presents itself before the philosophical questions even become relevant. And this problem makes everything else academic in the specific sense that it does not care about the philosophy at all. Orcs release spores. They do this constantly, throughout their entire lives, as a passive biological function that is no more controllable than respiration. Every moment that an orc exists anywhere, it is shedding biological material. This material is microscopic. These spores drift on air currents and settle in soil and find their way into water systems and propagate through the environment with the quiet persistence of something designed specifically to survive everywhere. The spores are not fragile. They are not deterred by chemical cleaning agents that would eliminate most biological contaminants. They are not stopped by standard air filtration systems. They are, in the assessment of the Magos biologists who have studied them, among the most biologically robust reproductive materials in the galaxy. When orcs fight in a location and then leave, they leave the spores behind. They cannot choose not to. It is not an option the orc can exercise through will or restraint, any more than a human can choose not to exhale. The Magos biologist has estimated, yet in studies that make for genuinely alarming reading in the relevant Ordo Xenos archives, that the only complete solution to an orc presence on a world is exterminatus, the destruction of the biosphere to a depth and temperature sufficient to sterilize every dormant spore in the soil. This is an extreme action, reserved for situations where no other option exists, and even it is not guaranteed to work if debris left the planet's surface before the bombardment reached full effect. On worlds that were supposedly cleared of orcs, decades later, sometimes 50 or 60 years later, feral tribes emerge from wilderness areas. These orcs grew from spores left by an army that fought and died a generation before them. They emerge with no memory of that army, no connection to the warlord who led it, and no knowledge of the campaign that planted the seeds of their existence. They simply emerge, fully orc, fully aggressive, fully equipped by their genetics with the instinct for violence and the biological tools to execute it, and they raid the nearest human settlement, and the process of orc infestation begins again. Now imagine allowing a live orc to walk around inside an imperial settlement, through city streets, through market districts, through the chambers of government buildings and the corridors of military installations. Every breath the orc takes, every step it takes, every second of its biological existence is seeding the surrounding environment with spore material. The administratum clerk who stood next to the orc in a meeting and breathed the same air is carrying spores home on their clothes and in their lungs. And the carpets and upholstered furniture in the governor's audience chamber are contaminated. The air filtration system in the building has distributed trace orc biology to every room on every floor. The soil around the building's foundation has received a continuous low-level dosing for however long the orc has been present. In 40 years, or 60 years, or in some cases longer, some of that material will germinate. Not much. The conditions are not ideal. The orc population density required to produce a major infestation is not present. But something will grow, in a neglected garden plot, in the fungal growth beneath the flooring of a poorly maintained building, in the wild margins of the city where maintenance does not reach. Squigs first, and most humans won't recognize what they're looking at when they see them. Then snotlings, then Gretchen. And then one day, something much larger and much more aggressive. And by the time it's recognized for what it is, the infestation has had years of undisturbed development beneath everyone's notice. This is not a hypothetical concern inflated for dramatic effect. This is the actual biological reality of the species, documented by imperial scholars who have studied it at great professional risk in appropriately sealed environments on appropriately isolated research stations. The orc does not have to do anything aggressive to represent a genuine long-term threat to any imperial world it visits. Its presence alone is a form of slow invasion, arriving quietly, making itself known only decades later when it is considerably harder to address. Or any imperial authority seriously considering even a temporary arrangement with an orc would need to achieve several things simultaneously that are currently beyond any known imperial technology to accomplish. Completely contain all biological output from the orc for the duration of its presence. Maintain that containment with perfect reliability under real-world operating conditions, and continue monitoring and remediation efforts indefinitely after the orc's departure. The spore problem is not solved by killing the orc. The spore problem is only solved by sterilizing everything the orc ever touched. The blood of an orc contains chlorophyll and countless distinct fungal organisms. The bones contain fungal matter. What the skin sheds cells that carry genetic material sufficient to eventually initiate the reproductive cycle under the right conditions. There is no way to have an orc present without having the potential for a future orc infestation present. The two things are biologically inseparable as a dandelion from its seeds. The Ordo Xenos has issued standing protocols that even captured orc specimens for scientific study must be held in sealed facilities on uninhabited worlds or in space stations with no direct atmospheric connection to any inhabited system. Not because the captive orc is going to pick its locks and start a war, but because the captive orc is already doing biological damage simply by existing, and that damage cannot be contained by anything less than complete environmental isolation. Letting one walk around freely in an imperial settlement, even the most cooperative, most diplomatically inclined, most remarkably restrained orc imaginable, would be treated by the Ordo Xenos as biological warfare. Not intentional biological warfare. Not warfare the orc was aware it was conducting, but warfare nonetheless, with casualties that would manifest decades later in a community that had no way of knowing the source of the problem. Part 9. The Theological Collision. Gork, Mork, and the God Emperor. We've established the biological problem. Let's now address the spiritual one, because in the Imperium of man, spiritual problems carry the weight of law, of cultural identity, of everything that holds the institution together across 1,000,000 worlds and 10,000 years. The Imperium is not a secular state. It never was. Well, not even in its earliest days before the imperial creed was formalized into its current overwhelming institutional presence. The emperor himself, as described in the oldest sources, had complex and not entirely positive feelings about being worshipped as a deity. But the institution that grew around him during his incapacitation has built a religious infrastructure so vast and so deeply embedded in imperial culture that the presence of faith is simply the air that imperial citizens breathe. The God Emperor is in the morning prayers that start every working day on most imperial worlds. He is in the architecture of every major public building, in the iconography on every banner, in the oaths that every soldier swears and every official takes. He is not a political concept. He is a lived reality for billions of human beings who genuinely, who sincerely believe that the universe was made for his people, and that his will is expressed in every imperial victory and every Xenos defeat. For an orc to participate in any formal imperial capacity, even the most limited and transactional one, would require engaging with this in some way. Not necessarily converting, not necessarily abandoning Gork and Mork, but at minimum existing in an environment where their absence of the Emperor's faith would be noticed and challenged and eventually addressed by the institutional mechanisms designed to address exactly such absences. The ecclesiarchy's response to learning that an alien was present in any formal imperial role, especially an alien that openly held religious allegiances to non-human warp entities, would be swift and loud and would involve fire in quantities measured in city blocks. And the preachers would have their sermons. The faithful would have their responses to those sermons. The formal protests from the ministorum to whoever permitted the arrangement would be logged and archived and used as evidence in the heresy proceedings. And whatever quiet, pragmatic arrangement had been made in some distant border governor's office would be undone by the wave of institutional outrage that the public knowledge of it generated, because the orc's relationship with Gork and Mork cannot simply be set aside by an act of will, cannot be suppressed through a decision to participate in imperial culture instead. Gork and Mork are not merely beliefs, they are realities. They are entities that exist in the Imperium and that maintain an ongoing connection to their worshippers through the collective Gestalt field. Every orc carries a thread of connection to this field, a psychic resonance that ties it to its species, and through its species to the divine embodiments of greenskin nature. In a setting where no other orcs are present, that connection is attenuated, weakened, reduced to something closer to background noise, but it does not disappear. It persists as a low-level constant, a permanent signal in the psychic background of wherever the orc finds itself. The Ordo Malleus, the arm of the Inquisition dedicated to demonic and warp-related threats, would have a very specific opinion about the wisdom of housing any entity with a permanent connection to warp entities inside an imperial facility. The opinion would be delivered in the specialized terminology of warp threat assessment, and the conclusion would be expressed in terms that began with unacceptable risk and ended somewhere around purge the location and rebuild. There is also a dimension of this that extends beyond the immediate theological objection into something more philosophically interesting. The Emperor's soul, whatever form it currently takes within the Golden Throne, and the psychic structure of the Astronomicon, is an actual entity in the Imperium. The Emperor genuinely exists in the warp in some form, genuinely influences the physical world through the beacon that guides Imperial ships through the void, genuinely represents something more than simply the corpse of a remarkable human being. The Imperial creeds claim that the Emperor is the only legitimate divine entity in the galaxy is not merely theological assertion. It is, as within the framework of the setting's metaphysics, partly true. Gork and Mork are also real, also genuinely present in the Imperium, also genuinely capable of influencing the physical world. These two facts, both true, cannot both be accommodated within the theological framework of the Adeptus Ministorum. The ministry cannot acknowledge that Gork and Mork are real without undermining the claim that the Emperor is the sole legitimate divine presence, and it cannot tolerate the presence of an entity connected to those realities within the fold of the institution that makes that claim. The theological collision, then, is not simply a clash of cultural values or incompatible belief systems. It is a conflict at the level of metaphysics. It's between two actually existing divine realities that cannot coexist within the same institutional framework without one of them either being denied or being used to undermine the other. Part 10. Could it ever work? Edge cases and radical possibilities. We have spent considerable time building a comprehensive and honest case for why the answer to our central question is no, or at best, not in any meaningful way. But this would be an incomplete and in some ways dishonest exploration if we didn't look seriously at the edges of the problem, at the places where the usual rules don't fully apply, where the strangest things occasionally do happen in the 41st millennium. The rogue trader is the most obvious edge case. A rogue trader operates under a warrant of trade. There's an ancient document of near-sacred authority that grants its holder the right to operate beyond the borders of the Imperium, to make contact with alien species for trade purposes, to hire aliens as crew members or auxiliary fighters, and generally to conduct the expansion of humanity's reach into the void in ways that would get anyone else executed. Rogue traders have worked with Bloodaxe mercenaries in documented cases. There are sealed accounts of rogue trader vessels carrying Orc commando units as hired auxiliaries for specific operations in lawless regions. The warrant provides legal cover that no other Imperial entity possesses for this kind of arrangement. But the rogue trader's latitude has hard limits. It does not extend to bringing a living Orc into any port in Imperial space without consequences. It does not protect the trader from the Inquisition's attention indefinitely, and the spore contamination problem applies regardless of what authority the warrant provides. A rogue trader who brought a live Orc into a functioning Imperial port city would find their warrant insufficient protection against the biological consequences of that decision manifesting 40 years later. The warrant gives you the authority to do things. It does not make the things you do consequence-free. The Radical Inquisitor is the second edge case, and arguably the more interesting one for this thought experiment. The Inquisition contains within its ranks a spectrum of philosophical positions ranging from the extreme Puritan, who believes every tool of the alien must be destroyed, and every taint of Xenos influence purged without exception, to the radical, and who believes that certain tools of the alien can be turned to Imperial purposes under sufficient supervision and with sufficient strategic justification. A Radical Inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos, specifically one whose professional focus was on extracting usable intelligence about the Orc species, might in theory attempt to cultivate a working relationship with an unusual and communicative Orc specimen, not out of any sympathy or respect for the creature. Radical Inquisitors are not soft. They are often the opposite of soft, pursuing their objectives with a ruthlessness that would disturb even their Puritan colleagues if they knew the full extent of it. But a radical's ruthlessness is in service of effectiveness, and an Inquisitor who could extract genuine, accurate intelligence about Orc social structures, military doctrine, but internal politics, gestalt field mechanics, and the relationship between Orc intelligence and the scale of the surrounding conflict would have access to the most valuable Xenos intelligence in the Imperium's possession. The arrangement would need to take place in absolute secrecy. The Orc would need to be held in a genuinely isolated environment, something like a sealed station far from any inhabited system, with the most rigorous possible spore containment protocols. The Inquisitor would need to maintain the fiction that the arrangement did not exist in any format that could reach other arms of the Inquisition. They would need to conduct the interviews, if we can call them that, quickly enough to get the intelligence, but slowly enough that the Orc did not simply become bored and destructive. Of the documented history of Radical Inquisitors working with Xenos is one of the more interesting and consistently instructive narratives in the setting. The outcomes follow a pattern. The initial stages are more productive than critics would have predicted. The intelligence obtained has genuine value, and then something goes specifically and predictably wrong in a way that reflects the alien nature of the entity being engaged with, rather than the incompetence of the Inquisitor managing the arrangement. The Orc in this scenario would eventually do what Orcs do. It would find the walls of its containment less interesting than the idea of what is outside them. It would communicate in ways that are friendly, right up to the moment they aren't. Its size would continue increasing as a function of ongoing stress stimulation. And an orc that has been in high-stress containment for several months is physically larger and more capable than the orc that entered that containment. The intelligence gathered would be real and valuable, and eventually superseded by the logistical problem of the orc itself. What about a scenario where an entire community of orcs, not a raiding party, but an established settlement, had been isolated on a world too remote and inhospitable for the Imperium to bother reclaiming, and had over several generations developed something resembling a stable territorial presence that limited its aggressive radius? Feral orcs do exist in exactly this state on many worlds. Low technology, limited range, contained by geography, and the absence of the gestalt field density needed to trigger a major expansionist drive. That these populations are not trying to join the Imperium. They are not trying to do anything with the Imperium. They are simply there, doing orc things at a low and manageable intensity. And the Imperium is choosing not to spend the resources on exterminatus because the cost doesn't justify the benefit. This is the closest thing to a tolerated orc presence that actually exists in the lore. Not cooperation, not integration, not joining. Simple containment, maintained by distance and low priority, acknowledged rather than resolved. It is not what we are asking about, but it is worth noting as evidence that the Imperium does, occasionally, make pragmatic decisions to not spend the resources needed to completely eliminate a threat when the threat is manageable by simply not engaging with it. The truest edge case, though, the one that comes closest to making the thought experiment genuinely interesting, is this. What if the common enemy was sufficiently catastrophic? What if the Tyranid threat, or a chaos incursion of sufficient scale, created a context in which temporary operational coordination between Imperial forces and orc elements was the only way that anyone involved survived? The Octarius War offers a flavor of this. The Inquisition deliberately introduced Tyranids to an orc empire, not as a cooperative gesture, but as a weaponized chess move, hoping that orc and Tyranid would destroy each other. The outcome was more complicated than intended, but the point is that the Imperium is capable of using orc nature as a strategic instrument. The step from using orc nature to coordinating with orc forces is enormous. But the precedent for pragmatic engagement with the orc problem, rather than simple extermination, exists. In a scenario of absolute existential crisis, perhaps an orc warlord approaching an Imperial commander and offering to fight alongside Imperial forces against a Tyranid hive fleet, with the simple and genuine orc logic that the Tyranids want to eat everything, including the orcs, and therefore the orcs have a reason to fight them. Something like operational cooperation might be possible for a limited duration, not integration, not membership, not trust in any meaningful sense, but a shared target for a defined period, maintained by mutual interest until mutual interest stopped being mutual. This would last until one of two things happened. The Tyranids were defeated or reduced enough that the orcs found the humans more interesting as targets, or the orcs grew sufficiently large and confident from the fighting that the humans became a more interesting prospect than the continued alliance. In either case, the conclusion would be remembered by both parties as an object lesson in why this was a bad idea. Part 11. What this tells us about the galaxy. The question we started with, what happens when an orc tries to join the Imperium of man, has 1,000 different specific answers depending on the specific circumstances of the asking. A Bloodaxe commando at a frontier garrison, a prime orc emissary at a desperate governor's court, a strange and isolated individual who has been separated from its kind long enough to develop unusual perspectives, an entire clan approaching the Imperium in some formal capacity. Each of these generates different dynamics, different conversations, different timelines before the inevitable conclusion is reached. But all of those answers converge eventually on the same point. The orc cannot join the Imperium. Not really. Not in any way that represents what joining actually means, what it requires, what it produces in terms of mutual commitment and shared obligation and the day-to-day reality of being part of something larger than yourself. And the reason is not simple. It is not reducible to the Imperium is prejudiced, or orcs are too violent, or any other single-factor explanation, though both of those things are true in their way. As the reason is structural, built into the foundations of what both of these things are, in ways that cannot be reformed or negotiated away without fundamentally changing what both of them are. And changing what they are, in either case, would produce something that is no longer the thing we started with. The Imperium was shaped by 10,000 years of war and betrayal and chaos and alien invasion into an institution that processes every non-human presence as a threat. Not because it has always done so thoughtlessly, not because the individuals within it are uniformly cruel or stupid, but because the cost of processing non-human presences as non-threats, when you get it wrong in a universe this dangerous, is civilizational. But the machinery was built to be comprehensive and cautious, because the alternative is letting through something that unmade everything, and the memories of what was let through when the machinery was insufficient still haunt the highest levels of the Inquisition. Over 10,000 years, comprehensive and cautious hardened into absolute, and absolute became theological, and theology became the foundation of the culture itself, the deepest layer of what the Imperium is that you reach when you strip everything else away. You cannot ask the Imperium to make an exception to its deepest institutional values without asking it to question what it is built on. And you cannot expect an institution that has survived for 10,000 years, by not questioning its foundations, to suddenly develop the capacity for that kind of examination in response to one green-skinned individual at the gate. The orcs, for their part, were engineered for a purpose that never included being good citizens of anything. Their biology makes them permanently, passively dangerous through their very existence, seeding every environment they occupy with the reproductive material of future wars in a way that cannot be separated from the organism because it is the organism. Their psychology makes sustained, genuine cooperation with any external authority possible only as a tactic, and a temporary tool deployed in service of the same fundamental drives that have always been driving them and that will always reassert themselves when the tactical advantage of cooperation has been exhausted. Their religion connects them to entities that are incompatible with every religious claim the Imperium makes about the nature of the divine. Their nature is not a choice they are making. It is what they were made to be, by beings much smarter than anyone alive today, for purposes that those beings took to the grave. There is something worth sitting with in this incompatibility, something that goes beyond the entertainment value of the thought experiment and reaches into what the setting is actually saying about itself, about the kind of universe it is, about the things it refuses to allow. The orcs are a weapon built by an ancient civilization to fight a war that ended millions of years ago. The war ended. The civilization that built the weapon is gone. The weapon remains, pointing in every direction at once because there is no longer anyone to aim it, still functioning perfectly in terms of the purpose it was designed for, catastrophically unfunctioning in terms of any other purpose a tool might serve. They are not evil. Calling an orc evil is like calling a storm evil. The attribution does not quite land because evil implies a choice between alternatives, and the orc's nature does not accommodate that choice in any deep sense. It has what it was made with, and what it was made with is extraordinarily thorough. The Imperium is a civilization built by a remarkable human being with an extraordinarily long perspective to last forever, to protect humanity against a galaxy that is full of things that want humanity dead, to carry the light of human potential through the darkness until the darkness could be beaten back. It was built under extreme duress, maintained under conditions of continuous and escalating crisis, and shaped over thousands of years into something its founder, assuming he could speak, might find both recognizable and deeply troubling. Its xenophobia is its armor, and its armor has grown so thick over so many generations that it has started to become a cage as much as a shield. And the humans inside the Imperium are protected from the alien and also separated from whatever potential the universe might have held for things to be otherwise. When an orc approaches the gate, what it finds is not simply hostility. it finds the full weight of both of these things. The weapon asking to be something other than a weapon, and the fortress that has forgotten there might be other ways to survive. Neither of them has the capacity to become what the encounter would require. The orc cannot become not orc enough to be trusted. The Imperium cannot become not Imperium enough to allow the trust. And so the gate stays closed, and the shooting starts, and the eternal war continues, and the galaxy remains exactly what it is. What is perhaps the most remarkable thing about all of this is the detail that elevates the question from a fun thought experiment into something more genuinely interesting, is that both sides of this equation are right about the danger the other represents. The Imperium is correct that any orc presence is a biological threat that will produce consequences decades hence. It is correct that the theological incompatibilities are not merely cultural, but metaphysical. It is correct that the history of orc-imperial interaction does not support an optimistic reading of what happens when these two things share space. The orc is correct, in its own way, that the Imperium represents an enormous enemy with enormous resources, and that fighting it is the primary activity available and the primary reward available, which in orc terms is not a complaint but a description of excellent circumstances. They are each responding to the other rationally, given what they are. The tragedy is not irrationality. The tragedy is that rationality, in this universe, produces this outcome. There is a kind of deep, quiet sadness in thinking about what the orc might be if the ancient engineers had made different choices in those distant millions of years when the species was being shaped. If the biological drive toward violence had been softer, more directed, more capable of being fully satisfied by a single conflict rather than always generating the hunger for the next one. If the reproductive strategy had not made every dead orc a seed of future conflict, had not made killing an orc an agricultural act with decades-long consequences. If the Gestalt field had been oriented towards something other than the amplification of aggression, if it had been tuned toward cooperation or problem-solving or any of the other collective behaviors that social species sometimes develop. The old ones were building a soldier race for a specific war. They built it extraordinarily well. They did not build it for after the war, because perhaps they did not expect there to be an after, or perhaps they simply did not consider it a relevant design constraint for a weapon system. And there is a kind of deep, quiet sadness in thinking about what the Imperium might have been if 10,000 years of crisis had not created this particular shape of institution. If the Horus heresy had not cracked everything open and let corruption and paranoia into every joint. If the War of the Beast had ended before it reached terror, and the Inquisition had been founded in a context of relative confidence rather than absolute existential terror. If the slow grind of continuous war and loss had not made the Imperium into the specific kind of desperate, fearful, magnificent, terrible thing that it is. It might have been something that could, under the right circumstances, find a way to ask a question before firing. It might have been something that could see the orcs approach and perceive, however briefly, however cautiously, the extraordinary strangeness of the moment. But that Imperium is not the Imperium of the 41st millennium. That Imperium is a story that was never told, a path through history that was closed by the heresy and sealed shut by everything that followed. And the Imperium that was told is this one, fortified beyond easy comprehension, eternal and wounded in every possible way, burning with the faith that kept it alive through 10,000 years of impossible crisis, and absolutely certain, with the certainty of an institution that has paid dearly for the consequences of uncertainty, that the alien cannot be allowed to live. And the orc that cannot join it is this one, fungal and magnificent in its particular way, designed from the foundation of its biology for war, connected to the immaterium through the vast psychic echo of its species, finding its fullest expression in the very conflict that makes any other existence impossible. Built from the ground up to be everything the Imperium cannot accommodate, and not knowing, not capable of knowing, that this is what it is. Yet the setting has a profound awareness of its own darkness. Warhammer 40,000 knows what it is. It knows that the Imperium is not a good institution, knows that the orcs are not simply monsters, knows that the tragedy of the 41st millennium is not located in the evil of any single actor, but in the architecture of a universe that has been shaped by its history into something that grinds goodness down and leaves only survival. The grimdark aesthetic is not simply a stylistic choice, it is the setting's thesis, that some problems do not have solutions, that some incompatibilities cannot be resolved, that the best you can sometimes do is understand what you're looking at. That is what this question does when you look at it carefully. It shows you, from an unexpected angle, exactly what the orcs are, and exactly what the Imperium is, and exactly why those two things cannot coexist. It illuminates both species through the specificity of their encounter, the way that bringing two things into contact often reveals more about each of them than studying either one in isolation. The orc at the gate is not just an absurd premise, it is a lens, and what it shows us through that lens is the full weight of the setting's internal logic, all the ways that the 41st millennium was built to be what it is, all the ways that its elements were designed to be incompatible with each other by an ancient history that predetermined the outcomes long before any of the characters were born. It is a strange thing to love a setting this dark, to find beauty in the examination of why things cannot be otherwise. It's in the detailed exploration of incompatibilities that are not anyone's fault, but that produce outcomes that are everyone's tragedy. Warhammer 40,000 is a setting that takes the question, what if things were better? And answers it not with hope, but with a very specific kind of honesty about how hard better is to achieve when the history is long enough and the wounds are deep enough and the systems built to cope with the worst possible outcomes have made those outcomes the only ones they know how to process. The orc at the gate that does not open, the story that tells us something true about what happens when two things, each exactly what they were made to be, encounter each other in a universe that was not designed to be kind about such encounters. The question that sounds like a joke and turns out to be, as if you follow it long enough, a very precise description of what the universe of the 41st millennium fundamentally is. That is the answer to our question, not 3 words, but everything those 3 words are standing in front of, all the depth and all the darkness and all the strange, specific beauty of a universe that is terrible and enormous and endlessly worth understanding. Thank you for being here. Thank you for spending this time with me and with the lore today. If you made it this far, through all of that depth and detail and careful thinking about one of the funniest sounding questions that contains one of the most genuinely sobering answers, then you already know what this channel is. You know it's not about the battles. Not really, not at its core. It's about the world behind the battles. Yeah, the ancient and terrible logic that makes every fight inevitable. The way the lore repays careful attention with insights that are not always comfortable, but are always worth having. Every time we sit with one of these questions, every time we follow the lore down to its foundations and see what it's actually built on, we understand the setting a little more completely. And understanding it more completely is not the same as making it less dark. The darkness is still there. The tragedy is still there. But understanding it means seeing it clearly rather than just feeling overwhelmed by it. And there is genuine value in that clarity, in the ability to say, with some confidence, here is what this is. Here is why it is this way. Here is what it means. If this was something you found valuable, please leave a like. It tells the algorithm, which is its own kind of strange institutional machinery, that this kind of content is worth surfacing. Subscribe if you haven't, because this is what Q on 40K does, and we're going to keep doing it. Exploring the questions that the lore raises when you sit with them quietly instead of rushing past them to the next engagement. There are so many questions like this one waiting in the 41st millennium, and we have all the time we need to ask them carefully. The comments are open, and I read every one. Drop your thoughts there. Tell me what you think this question reveals about the setting that I might have missed or understated. Tell me what edge case you'd want to push further. Tell me what question you want us to look at next, in this same slow, careful, unhurried way. Unhurried. The conversation in the comments is one of the things I value most about this channel. The Emperor protects. Even if sometimes what he's protecting everyone from is exactly what would be needed to make protection unnecessary. See you next time.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.